Okay, hello everybody and welcome. I am Paisley Rectal, your state poet laureate, and welcome to the Utah Poetry Festival 2022. I'm delighted to open up this weekend's core festival events with today's craft session. And I'd like to acknowledge that this event is taking place virtually on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes, and that Utah is home to 8 distinct tribal nations. Before we begin, before I hand this over to the moderator, Kimberly Johnson, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Utah Division of Arts and Museums and the Utah Humanities Council, for making these events possible. I'd also like to thank today's ASL interpreter, Kim Hawker, for making our event more accessible. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming and supporting poetry. If you're interested in today's talk, I'm pretty sure you're going to be interested in more of the virtual craft talk that's taking place today, or our final headline reading at 7 p.m., which is also taking place virtually. John Belk, Danielle Dabrowski, and Nancy Takacs, all poets from Southern Utah, will be reading from their just published collections. You can register for that at our website, www.utahpoetryfestival.com, which I will put in the chat. I'll also put the schedule link in the chat for all of you to see the other talks today and events that are going on statewide and throughout the rest of this month. All registration and location information can be found via that link. Today's speakers all have books, and we have a wonderful virtual book fair going on. So I will be putting the link to our book fair into the chat throughout this session to remind you to support these wonderful poets by purchasing their fantastic books. Today's session is a largely informal conversation between the panelists. To ask questions, please use the Q&A feature. To sing our panelists' praises, please use the chat feature. Your moderator will be handling the questions and reading them to the panelists as needed. So that's the housekeeping for this afternoon or early morning. I don't even know what time it is anymore. So I will hand this over to your moderator, Kimberly Johnson, and see you in 45 minutes.
Thank you, Paisley. Thank you all for joining, and thanks especially to our panelists for being here today. Let me introduce the people who are in this Zoom room with us. In addition to our ASL interpreter, Kim Harker, we also have 3 poets. I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. Meg Day is the author of the collection Last Psalm at Sea Level, which was published in 2014. And the co-editor of Laura Hershey on the Life and Work of an American Master, which was published in 2019 as part of the Unsung Masters series through Pleiades Press. Day is assistant professor of English and creative writing at Franklin and Marshall College. Michael Lavers is the author of the collection After Earth, published by the University of Tampa Press. His poems have appeared widely, including in Plowshares and the Best New Poets 2015. He has been awarded the University of Canberra Vice Chancellor's International Poetry Prize, the Moth Poetry Prize, and the Bridport Poetry Prize, and he lives with his wife, the writer and artist Claire Ackerbrand, and their 2 children in Provo, Utah, and teaches at BYU. John Talbot's poems and verse translations appear in various journals and anthologies in the US and in the UK. He is the author of 2 books of verse, The Well-Tempered Tantrum and Rough Translation. He regularly publishes scholarly articles and books on ancient Greek, Latin, Italian, and English poetry, and he teaches at BYU. And I am here for the ride today and to enjoy along with you this conversation between poets whose craft is impeccable. And my name is Kimberly Johnson. I am the author of 4 collections of poetry, most recently Fatal, which will be, well, I think that if you order it, you can receive it tomorrow. That's what I'm told anyway by reliable sources. And I teach Renaissance literature and creative writing at BYU. So welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for joining us today. I want to, because this conversation today is an opportunity for us to think together about some of the challenges and some of the possibilities that poetic form affords to practitioners of poetry. I wanted to start today by just asking each of you to reflect for a moment, if we could, about your own relationship with form. Some poets think of themselves as deeply formalist. Some poets appropriate or adopt principles of formal practice. So maybe if we can start by thinking these questions through together and identifying our own investments, we can start to have a shared foundation to proceed. So can I invite Meg to begin?
I'd be happy to. Thank you so much for having me. Gosh, why do I engage with form? Do I engage with form? My relationship with form is rooted in my early objection to and resistance of inherited form, largely through my misunderstanding of it. I think, like many of my students, I came to understand inherited form as a kind of punishment and as a kind of arbitrary exercise. And it was demonstrated largely by texts from dead white men whose topics at the time seemed irrelevant to my life, as did the constraints. And I think that as I, read further, I better understood the origins of form and then also the possibilities of it. And I think that my current understanding is one of deep affection. And I think I engage with form largely through the queering of it. I'm interested in and pursuant of mastery and pleasure. I think that I am most interested in the way that inherited form is a productive space and is perhaps my favorite kind of like consensual constraint, that my poems may indeed not satisfy what hard-nosed formalists or even critics prefer to call, satisfied inherited form. But I think the queering of form, the near form, the remade form is one that is necessary and urgent in this particular moment. And so perhaps I'll stop there, but I'm really excited about what's possible for form, and have grown away from feeling as if it is restricting, and instead find it quite liberatory.
Thank you. Michael.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Meg. It's great to be here. I'm very excited to participate in this, excited to hear from you all and learn from you all. My relationship with form, I suppose, is slightly strange. I think I'm in love with form, received forms, but also free verse. I think all poetry has a form. As soon as you put language on a page, there suddenly is a shape. And it's up to the poet to carve that shape into as incantatory or revelatory or exciting a shape as possible, depending on what the effects, are desired. I think it's undeniable that the form of a poem is what conveys most of its power. T.S. Eliot says in his essay on Dante, I think, that a great poem can communicate before it is understood. And I think this is partly what he means by that, that the sound waves of a poem, the sonic structures, the visual structures have palpable and impalpable effects on us that both relate to, but also transcend the quote unquote content of the poem. So when I write poetry, I go back and forth between received forms and free verse, kind of, I suppose, to use Emerson's word, on a whim. I get tired of writing sonnets, I'll do free verse. I get tired of free verse, I'll go to blank verse, et cetera, et cetera. I'm mostly just interested in the way in which all of these can establish a kind of incantatory music or an incantatory experience for the reader. And yeah, maybe for now I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Michael. John. Oh, you are muted, John.
Sorry, it's a good thing I was muted. because I've reconsidered my thoughts in the intervening few seconds, and I think my second draft will be better. I think I was thanking Michael and thanking Meg for those comments. I'm glad to hear of Meg's conversion, and I'm glad to know that you weren't like me, which I came out of the womb loving very, very formal structures. Not just the kind of form that Michael rightly alludes to, which is the form that any poem is likely to have if it's well built, free verse, but also the kinds of formal poetry that are most likely to come to mind when people use a term like formal poetry. I just love it. I love its connection to the past. I love the way that honoring traditional forms creates the basis for innovation. I'm very skeptical about the possibility of innovation where there's not a conception of tradition. And I guess I'm going to confess something rather perverse. There's any number of poems whose subject matter I don't even consider until I've come to a sense of the formal contours of the poem, whatever those formal contours might happen to be. There was an embarrassing moment some years ago when I was teaching at another university on the other side of the country, and a student of mine asked for a lift home. These were in the days where you could actually give a student a lift home without incurring all kinds of legal problems. We lived in the same neck of the woods. And he was asking me questions about the four quartets of T.S. Eliot's, asking me what the poem meant. And it occurred to me I'd never really considered what the poem meant, even though I'd read it 100,000 times, and it was one of my favorite poems. So we pulled over to the side of the road into a parking lot, I think it was. And that's the first time, and only because I was forced to, that I began to consider that T.S. Eliot's poem had semantic content as well as formal content. Now that's perverse. It shouldn't be, but I'm just that bad. And so I guess you could say in my own poetry, I have a similar kind of investment. I really want to say a shape before it occurs to me to say something of semantic content. It's probably very bad.
Thanks to all three of you for those answers. And I want to seize upon a thread that's kind of been coming to the surface here, which is this notion, I guess Michael articulated it in these terms, all poetry has a form. So can we talk about, I think that many folks are accustomed to thinking about poetry and like they recognize, oh, if it's 14 lines of rhyming iambic pentameter, that's a sonnet. And if it doesn't have those recognizable things that we are taught in, I don't know, 6th grade to recognize as the traditionally inherited forms, then we perhaps think of them as formless. So what happens in free verse, I guess, is the question that I'm circling around to. If all poetry has a form, how can we start thinking about the way that form operates in the absence of inherited verse structures? I don't think we have to go in any particular order, but if you all have, just feel free to unmute, as it were.
Well, maybe one way of beginning would be to say I'm not convinced that just because I'm looking at a piece of writing that has 14 lines of alternating stressed and unstressed syllables, that is formal, that I would accept that as meeting the criterion of being formal. Whereas I could point to a free verse poem that is much more formal than the kind of example that I've given, and vice versa. So there's got to be some other dimension than just existing as a poem that brings a poem into the world of genuine form.
So what is that something other? Because it's true, we could take the, I don't know, an owner's manual for a refrigerator and break it into 14 lines. Would that be, I'm willing to consider that depending on contexts, might well be a poem. Do you all have thoughts about that, Michael?
Well, there's a question in the chat. What is the difference between form and structure? And on one hand, I think you could say those two words are sometimes synonymous. Anything that has an outline has a form or a structure. If it has a contour, if it's set apart in the world as a self-existing object, whether or not it's good or aesthetically valuable or, beautiful or well made. It doesn't have to be well made to have a form or a structure. If it has an outline, it has a form or a structure. I think John's alluding to something else, something well made, something well wrought, something beautiful, something that is formal in the sense of well dressed. Yeah. And I like in some of these pre-existing emails that we were sending around to each other, John proposed the poetic line as a conduit of energy through tension, which is a phrase I very much love, energy through tension. And I think that that's when you could say that perhaps form is different from structure, because something formal, something that's well wrought, has a sense of beautiful energy and coexistent tension. Whereas any old lump of stuff, yes, it has a structure, it has a form, but it's not formal in that way. But I think energy through tension can exist in free verse, can exist in strict iambic pentameter, certainly exists in prose. A good prose sentence is a conduit of energy through tension, I think. So those would be my 2 cents.
I feel quite skeptical of this branch of the conversation, and I'm fine being an outlier in that way. It's not that I don't agree that there are poems indeed that satisfy more fully than others the requirements or the demands of particular inherited forms. And also, simultaneously, I find, how to say, I'm skeptical of the idea of something that is a near miss is then somehow ousted from the authority or the capacity or the potential to satisfy formal requirements, simply because there is no, I don't want to get into like a deep theoretical rabbit hole, but like there is no such thing as sameness, right? I'm thinking of so many things. I'm thinking of gender, of sex, of like what makes a person, the beauties in the way that it is different, and how it evolves and how it surprises and how it is bent and disruptive. And so I'm quite intrigued by the refrigerator manual and what it might teach me about how 14 lines might come alive in these other ways that both Michael and John are speaking to. Really resistant to the idea that there is such a, I don't know, a regimented expectation in order to satisfy. Maybe what I want to say is that I think sometimes we get in our own way, and that perhaps the poem has other things in mind that are not better, but fuller. I wonder if I'm making sense.
You are. Let me ask you this. What if we go back to the, what was the phrase that you used, Michael? Energy.
Well, this is John's phrase, a conduit of energy through tension.
Oh, that's right. A conduit of energy through tension. Does that liberate us a bit from the kinds of expectation that might seem to foreclose on invention?
Well, we could see restraints as a kind of engine for creating meanings all of the time. Anybody who's interested in sports has an instinctive has an instinctive reverence for the idea of restrictions and rules and boundaries, because it's those very restrictions and rules and boundaries that create the opportunities for greatest meaning in, say, a sporting event. They create tension. They create a sense, they create an area where expectation can be satisfied or frustrated. And given the context, they can create moments of great emotion. So Meg was saying a minute ago something about prose. It may be that the poetic line is the one thing that poetry has got that a writer of prose couldn't also do. the fact that the ending of a line in poetry is the decision of the poet, not the compositor. So that boundary where a line comes to an end is where I'm going to focus all of my expectation and attention in the way the sports femme would. So Milton writes something like, a line like, speaking of his blindness, seasons return, but not to me returns, line ending, day. And then that clause comes to an end just as a new line is beginning. Do you see what I mean? So the word return returns at the end of a line, and that boundary suddenly becomes visible and meaningful. And then the eye has to travel to the next line to collect this orphaned word day, you know, which is integral with the sentence, but cut off from the line. That's an instance where the boundaries are generating the tension that creates meaning and feeling. I love it. Looking for those moments in a poem.
Okay, I take your point, John, and I wonder if this way of imagining or continuing the terms of this discussion might be the more generative direction to move, because it seems to me that what you're describing, what we're starting to describe, is the way that structures of a variety of kinds, that is to say, formal or rhythmic, rhyming structures, or indeed syntactic or grammatical structures, set up certain kinds of expectations that poems then advantage themselves by flouting. So maybe one way to contemplate the distinction. Distinction, is that the word I'm trying to use? One way to contemplate the possibilities of form here is to acknowledge the way that it is deeply informed by the capacity, our capacity to create expectations and then disrupt them. How does that concept kind of sit with you all?
It sits with me very well. I think repetition, I've always, and maybe we can get into this, I've always struggled with conceiving of the line, quote unquote, the line, as a helpful unit of poetry. It's not a helpful doorway for me to get into poetry. But the idea of repetition with difference, or energy and, yes, what was John's phrase? Energy and constraint, energy and tension, repetition and difference, expectation, violation of expectation. That's, to me, where the magic is, for sure. And that happens outside of lines, inside of lines. The line, to me, and forgive me if I'm changing topic, since a line of poetry can be one word or many words, since it can be a dash or an ampersand, since it can be white space, since you can have prose poetry that doesn't have any lines at all. It's always seemed to be much true. It can be anything. And if it can be anything, it doesn't seem to be a category. Do you know what I mean? So I've always found it hard to pick up poetry with the handle of the line.
Yeah, you said that in the email exchange that we had over the course of this last week, Michael. And I happen to have had the benefit of having a long conversation in the past with both you and Meg about what the poetic line is. And so I'm intrigued by the notion that the poetic line, I mean, I've long been intrigued by the fact that the poetic line resists our definition. It's very, very difficult to theorize what a poetic line is. And yet, and I wonder if that's true. I mean, how to say this? As practitioners of poetry, it seems to be quite challenging to say, okay, this is how I'm going to conceptualize my lines. But as readers, isn't there an experience of a line, not in isolation, but as one component of a larger set of rhetorical gestures that produce an effect? Doesn't have to be Michael that answers, though Michael is.
I'll just say not for me, and then I'll remute myself.
Did you say you'll say no?
I'll say that is not the case for me.
Okay.
It's the case for me. I mean, I have the experience of lines, and you can approach theology apophatically and say, I can't say what God is, but it doesn't mean you're saying there is no God. I agree we can't exactly say what a line is, but I don't think that defies an experience of the line, or that it renders futile any attempt to put lines into words. Sorry, Michael's comment reminded me of something Robert Lowell said. I no longer know the difference between prose and verse, which I think is taking agnosticism just a little bit too far, because I value the difference between prose and verse, and that's partially a matter of valuing prose as much as verse. T.S. Eliot, towards the end of his life, said, the moment the immediate term verse is suppressed, I do not believe that any distinction between prose and poetry is meaningful. So Eliot will distinguish verse from poetry and prose on one side, but the existence of the word verse, if you think about its etymological meaning too, lends confidence to the idea that such a thing as a poetic line can exist. And I see it as an important building block.
Okay, and John, I'd like to say that you mean because verse means to turn. So that kind of, the turning of a line of verse is in part what you're describing. But I wonder, so you said that you valued the statement that there's a useful or indeed valuable distinction between prose and verse. I think for you also, there's a valuable distinction between poetry and verse, and that your investments lie primarily in verse. Would you not say that that's the case?
I think so. There are prose poems, but I can point to passages in novels that I would consider, I would say it's hard for me to tell the difference between, say, this passage of Moby Dick or Ulysses on the one hand, and poetry on the other. So yeah, I do see some type of poetry as not being composed in verse. And I think there's something very, very special about verse. I admire Kipling for insisting that his publishers publish his collected poems under the title of verse, not poetry. In doing so, he was insisting upon that distinction. There is something special when a poet ends a line, do you know what I mean? And makes the decision as to where the line ends, rather than, as fiction writers do or as prose writers do, are content to allow the compositor to determine, because the typographical setup, where the lines will end. Something valuable in saying, I insist on a decision about the introduction of white space between one line or another, or between one stanza or another.
Okay, that insistence on endings of some kind, or on the introduction of white space, as you put it, which is a decision that's in the hands of the person who writes the line or writes the lines of poetry, or the non-lines. I think that this allows us to incorporate a question that's coming in the Q&A, which is, where does intuition come into the poem? That is to say, each of you has been in the practice of writing poems wherein at some point the words stop moving across the page from left to right and are succeeded by white space. And the reader's eye is forced to turn and to go back to the beginning of the line that's just next down. So I wonder, how do you make those decisions? The question in the Q&A suggests that there's some degree of intuition involved in there. I think that's right. But I'd like to think and feel through the ways each of you make those decisions. Maybe Meg, you haven't talked for a few minutes. Can I put you on the spot?
Yes, of course. I've been thinking about disrupting expectations and violations of expectations, and I think that might be an essay we should write together, the four of us. It's just arguing back and forth. When I make lines, I'm thinking about attention. I think of lines primarily as a kind of instructions for reading, but they are built as I make them, they are built with the reader in mind in a kind of energetic reciprocity. I want for my readers to be having an experience that I am having. And I can assume certain things, some of which you've gestured toward, right? That if I'm writing in English, I can assume that we are reading from left to right, top to bottom. And so the tension of the line becomes this sort of horizontal, vertical kind of stretching of a canvas, for lack of a better analogy. And that I want very much for as much to be packed into those moments as possible. And for the instructions that I'm providing in the actual construction of the line to indicate how both intuitive and semantic meaning is conveyed. I do think that a lot of it is about intuition or about gut, but I think part of it also is about practice and coming to know oneself and one's priorities around attention. Yes.
Do you mean how you'd like the reader to direct attention and how you yourself as a writer are depositing your attention?
Yes, and how the tools that I have at hand in order to do so, the way that I understand the beginnings of lines to work versus the ends of lines, or the ways that they might be tethered together in the middle with particular sonic repetition in the form of a rhyme or otherwise, visual repetition, line length, the way that lines become meter, etc. Yeah.
How about the rest of you?
Well,
Michael, yeah.
I can say, I suppose, a similar confession to John's. I don't think I've ever broken a line for a particular reason. You know what I mean? I mean, or maybe that's a slight overstatement. Sometimes if I'm writing a sonnet, I break a line because I've got to the 10th syllable.
Yeah, isn't that a
That's
reason?
the reason. That's the reason, but
It's a good reason.
but it's not.
It's like ending a session at a poetry festival at 11:15 rather than 3:15.
Yes, but why do we do that? Because we just do. Why is the 3-point line painted a certain number of feet from the hoop?
24 seconds shot clock.
Because it's just because. There's nothing more to it than that for me. I've never broken a line of poetry for a reason greater than that. And certainly when I write free verse, it's all intuitive, 100%. I have those decisions are not made from here up ever for me. So for better or worse, most likely for worse, I can say.
Interesting. Can I just, do you mind if I read out a couple of lines of verse and see if I can connect them to the discussion? It really is a big question, especially if you're writing free verse. What is it that leads you to break a line? And if it's, as in Michael's case, if it's intuitive, then in retrospect, what leads you to conclude that it was a good decision to have broken the line? Here's a passage from Wordsworth.
Sorry, John, to interrupt you. Am I ever capable of saying it was a good decision? I doubt it. Do you know what I mean? I doubt it.
You're very self-effacing, and that's why you have.
Sorry, keep going.
No, that's why you have me to praise your poems, and indeed your line breaks. So you intuit and self-deprecate, and I will praise your poems. But here's a bit of Wordsworth. I think it's from The Excursion. He's talking about the spiritual presence of absent things, and he says, "And all," line break. Now here comes an iambic pentameter. "Their hues and forms were by invisible links," line break, "allied to the infections." So you could say, all right, Wordsworth writes, "Their hues and forms were by invisible links," and he's got to end the line there because that's what the constraints of blank verse require. He's come to that 10th syllable. But it just happens that the word he chooses to put in that 10th syllable is links. And then there's a severance of the line break. There's a cleavage. And then the next word is allied. So the two words on either side of that break that is a line break are linking words, link and allied.
Yeah.
The impulse may have been instinctive, or it may have been prescriptive. I've got to end the line break there because that's what the form tells me to do. But it was a great decision because there's a tension between the idea of splitting the line and the sense of linkage
But
to spirits that is there.
But if I was to read poetry only for moments like that, I would go years. I mean, that's such a rare moment. Do you know what I mean? That's not a requirement to me as a reader. That kind of wordplay isn't a requirement for me as a reader. Oh, I finally found a good line. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I sometimes
For every one of those that Wordsworth does, or for every one of those that Milton does, there's 30 where that kind of structural wordplay, I don't know how to describe it quite, isn't at play.
Michael, you said a few minutes ago that that you break lines out of intuition, but I might suggest that intuition is merely long practice, that you've practiced long enough as both a writer and a reader that you've stopped the work of thinking it through. I mean, surely you have spent a long time reading poems and trying to figure out what makes them powerful to you. And in your efforts to replicate the poetic practices that you find to be powerful, you've developed what seems to you to be intuition, but really sublimated practice, right?
But couldn't practice have almost nothing to do with articulatable theory? To practice a dance, for example, involves the body mostly. Do you know what I mean? You could read a book about how to do it. You could go to classes about how to do it, but the best way to do it is to just do it and do it and do it and do it and do it. So yes, practice, but how much of that practice is articulatable in a set of rules? You know what I mean? It wasn't as if I thought through all of these rules and then practiced the rules and then I've forgotten the rules because they became muscle memory. I think it was muscle memory more or less all the way down.
I wonder if you give yourself not enough credit there. Paisley in the chat is observing that one of the things that keeps poetry, the experience of reading and writing poetry, surprising for both writers and readers, is that lines are frequently broken for a variety of reasons. That even within the same poem, we might find a number of different instances of logic for line breaks, which keeps the poem surprising. So I guess another way of incorporating what Paisley is saying into this conversation is to return to the notion of surprise. So I'm wondering, how do you make surprises? How do you value surprise as a writer and as a reader? Is that too abstruse a question?
I give it a 7. I value surprise about 7.
I mean, it seems to me that surprise is the very point of things.
One of the nice things about poetic form is that it entails an interplay between being surprised and having one's expectations confirmed. I find both of them pleasurable.
Yeah, I think I lean in the direction of surprise. Back to our brief gesture toward violating expectations or disrupting expectations. I do wish in a poem to learn something, and learning is a kind of violent disruption to either, maybe not always my expectations, but certainly understand to be possible or true. And I think that for me filters down to the flexibility, though can I say flexibility of form in this room without being
Yes.
Yeah, the flexibility of form, or the possibility of form, which is reiterated through the act of breaking lines oftentimes. And so surprise, I think, is is crucial.
And Meg, you were talking about the flexibility of form, and I would add to that the flexibility of the formal tradition. There's been a comment in the chat that I think is important to bring on board, which is, where are the Nicole Seelys, the Tracy K. Smiths, the Jericho Browns, the Natalie Diaz's in this discussion? Because I do think that many contemporary readers think of formal poetry as primarily the province of dead white men. And it is important to acknowledge that form is, that there is a kind of hegemony that people resist about the formal tradition. And so when we see somebody like Evie Shockley incorporating poems robustly into her canon that experiment with traditional forms, or Jericho Brown incorporating traditional forms into his, Jericho Brown writes a lot of sonnets. So it's simply not the case that the formal tradition is a tradition that belongs to a certain kind of writer. And I think flexibility is one way that contemporary writers are arguing against that. I happened to teach a class last year on the sonnet tradition, and it's fascinating to me that most sonnet sequences written within the last, let's just say 50 years, are written by anyone other than straight white males. And I think that that's a provocative data point for this conversation. And so how are we, given that, Meg was talking about the kind of the appeal of rules, both primarily for the way that you can subvert or break or expand or be flexible with rules, that's where surprise is made possible. Can we think about the capacity of that flexibility to expand the poetic conversation? Meg, can I call on you again here?
Yes, the short answer is yeah, I agree with everything you're saying. I think that there's a resistance to understanding even slight deviations from very strict, rigid understandings of inherited form, and understanding those poems as somehow less than and not more than, or not the evolution of. I'm back at bodies. I don't think the body is a very helpful or productive metaphor for a poem, that the poem has a body and that this is its form and it breathes and et cetera, whatever. But when I return to the idea of understanding poems that fit into particular categories or fit into, satisfy different requirements, I'm drawn always to the poems that deviate in the way that people deviate. Like the hegemonic expectations are not interesting to me. One, because they're so repetitive and they seem quite overdone, but also they're not realistic. Why should I have to write in the same way, write a sonnet specifically, in the same way that, Willie Shakes does, or John Donne? I'm not him. I'm not him in so many ways, but primarily physical ones, not just from where I arrive, but also how I arrive and what makeup goes into the actual construction of the thing. It seems like a deeply ableist ideal, actually, not to mention one that centers whiteness and centers normativity of all kinds. It's deeply problematic. And so I'm very much in favor of an expansion, perhaps, of what is included and what qualifies, and perhaps a renegotiating of the authority that inherited form carries.
Michael?
Just to piggyback on that, I think that's true, and I think it's always been in a way more or less true. Harold Bloom says that to become a canonical work, every work that becomes a canonical work has to, by definition, have the counter-canonical built into it. I think this has always been true. If you think about Shakespeare's sonnets, just to write most of them to a young man, for example, that's counter-canonical.
Yes.
Wordsworth speaking in the language, quote unquote, of real people, that's counter-canonical. So the poetry that lasts, I think, has always been the poetry that, I think this is something that John began with, has one foot in the tradition and one foot firmly out of it.
And so-called free verse also, which has come to seem this kind of transparent dominant form in the late, particularly in the late 20th and early decade of the 21st century, has started out as counter-canonical and is becoming so canonical that I think that poets are rightly pushing against the apparent non-expectations, though I would quibble with that, of free verse. John, did you have a hand?
Well, yeah, just to build on what you're saying, Kim, and also what Michael is saying, we were talking before about whether or not a reconstituted instruction manual for a refrigerator. Can't remember what the color of the fridge was. Was it avocado? But whether or not that would count as formal poetry. And I would say no, for the reasons that Meg, I think, is getting at. Merely adhering to a set of mechanical commands isn't formal in my mind. That's just a kind of regimentation. And I think that, we just confine ourselves to English poetry as a whole. The great writers in the English language who have entered into some kind of conscious formal engagement have always been flexible and have always pushed against the previous examples. That's part of what formal poetry in particular makes available, a kind of flexibility that's not possible when every poem is merely idiosyncratic. Do you know what I mean? Belongs only to itself because it has nothing to compare itself to. There is a sonnet, talking of sonnets, there's a sonnet, I won't mention who it's by so as not to entail any controversy, but it's about a skylight. And the octet of the sonnet, the first 8 lines, is very, very strict and very, very regular as it describes the poet's unwillingness to be flexible and change. And then in the final 6 lines of the sonnet, the sestet, the meter becomes looser, the rhymes become more distant. The poet says that his change of mind held surprise wide open, since we were talking about surprise. And the sonnet form is just melting before our eyes, but it doesn't so completely melt as to then disqualify it as a sonnet or to destroy any sense of its being a sonnet. So I think formal tradition, when it's at its best, pushes against itself, pushes against boundaries, and is extraordinarily flexible. It's not merely an instance of regimentation or blind assertion of any one particular ideology. It can be marshaled to those instances, but in those cases, I think it fails. Sorry, that was boring.
Not at all.
Shoot, I have to come on. But I would
in the chat, and then you walked into the room.
Well, I'll let you guys go for a couple. This is better than any AWP panel I've ever attended, honestly. And I'm learning more from this than I've ever learned from that conference. So I will back off. If you'd like to go on for a couple more minutes to take any questions, that would be great.
Well, I mean, the question that you have raised in the chat just now, I think is a worthy question. Paisley asked in the chat, are sonnets modes of thought rather than specific and repetitive constraints? And if you don't mind, I'd like to share something fascinating I mentioned a few minutes ago this class that I taught last year on the history of the sonnet. And I was able to have a number of guests come and talk to my class because we were all on Zoom, right? And it was fascinating to me to hear. One of the questions we asked each of the guests was, what in your view is the least common denominator definitive quality of a sonnet? And every single one of them answered that question differently. Every single guest thought that a different baseline was crucial, and only that, for the definition of a sonnet. And so I wonder if this question that you've asked, Paisley, is kind of refracted into that experience, or refracted by that experience. That one thing form makes possible is a kind of it is a set of modes of thought. And those modes of thought are transmitted through the poetic tradition, but also instanced by or produced by the resistances of a particular iteration in a single poem against the bulk of texts that preceded. And that is what, I mean, it is inevitable, it seems to me, that the kind of individuated flexibility that Meg was articulating before should make its way into a formal poem, or else it would be doggerel. It would merely be performing a set of, I don't know, like a recipe, like a bad and bland recipe, a set of expectations. And fulfilling expectations is the most uninteresting version of a poetic experience.
And now I'm inserting myself into your panel, but I just could not help but think of a volume of poems called, I think it's Nomina by Karen Volkman. And it's entirely sonnets in which I think anyone would be baffled to understand what was happening. And it is simply the performance of constraint. And what's a fascinating thing is that you can have an emotional sense of catharsis and fulfillment via those cascading rhymes and not know a thing of what happened on it. And yet when you ask people, are you pleased with the poem? Would you return to it? Very few students in my experience would say yes. They would say, no, we've had the performance. I mean, it's sort of like a drag performance of, and not a fun drag performance of the sonnet, which is that it doesn't teach you more about the sonnet at all. It teaches you maybe your own limitations as a reader, wanting to hit rhymes to get a sense of completion, when completion really doesn't just happen through sound, if we're thinking about speaking back to the sonnet.
Yeah, and that takes me back to something that came up earlier in this conversation about expectation and fulfillment. Like, form does allow us to fulfill expectations, but that's just a way less interesting an aesthetic experience or a human experience than not fulfilling expectations, than having all the things you brought to the table upended by a comma, let's say. You know, these upendings occur in a variety of forms, but if expectations are not upended, there is nothing to reward reread.
Yeah, and I just want to say, and it's just shout out to Meg, we taught their poem, Batter My Heart, Transgender God, right after reading Done. And the students had a fantastic conversation to sort of figure out what it is that the sonnet is there for, what it is that the conceit does when transferred into a very different body and subject matter. They were able to have a more powerful response both to line and form itself via that understanding that it's not simply sonnetness on the page, if that makes any sense, that there has to be a reason why this conversation is taking place in this particular constraint and then being violated, much in the ways that Dunn wants to think about violation too, violated in ways that open that the speakers up, basically. I have totally bogarted your panel. I will stop. Is there anything you guys want to say?
The more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned, because the community of reading experiences that poetry offers, and the reason that we can justify inviting people into a reading experience with poetry, that is to say poetry, the big P, like come and read a whole bunch of poems, is because all these different perspectives get communicated over the course of a variety of texts. That's, if I wanted to spend all my time with a single mind, I'd just stay home all the time. And what fun, I mean, we did that.
We're doing that now, actually.
I would much rather spend time in any room, virtual or otherwise, with you all than just continuing to like pat myself on the back for being, you know, for not upending my own expectations. So I appreciate this conversation. Thank you, Paisley, for facilitating it. Thank you, all the panelists, for your smart and generous comments, and to Kim for ably interpreting this session for us. Thanks to all who showed up and to the people behind the scenes. Paisley, anything that you'd like to add to this?
If you enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it half as much as I did, there are more such conversations to be had. Go to the utahpoetryfestival.com schedule and register for any and all events. And there are in-person events going across the state throughout this whole month. I hope to see some of you there. And I hope to see more of you virtually today. Thank you so much for everything. You guys were fantastic. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.